perception change. Foreign labour isn't a competition, says an expert.
Till we get the amount of people here, we need to have agreements so that we can have workers from abroad working on visa arrangements. So when you bring in talent, for example, from abroad, you learn from their management skills.
All that and much more coming up on First. A member of the Deloitte Global Team on Climate and Sustainability, Talal Rafi, listed a host of benefits Sri Lanka will have by expanding the IT business process management sector. His views came during a public lecture yesterday on the topic, How Can SME Startups Navigate the Post-Pandemic Business Environment, which was organized by the Centre for Banking Studies of the Central Bank.
The IT BPM industry has a lot of positives to bring in. For example, this is one industry that, according to studies, show that it can indirectly create 2.5 jobs for each job in this sector. One of the reasons is that because most of the earnings come in dollars from outside and the employees are paid much higher. As employees are paid much higher, there is a lot more money there for domestic consumption. So, for example, entertainment or domestic tourism, financial services, the construction industry. So this is one industry that we need to focus on. And we're also perfectly positioned for this. Sri Lanka is the first country in South Asia to test 5G. And when it comes to 4G coverage, we cover around 95% of the population. Sri Lanka, for example, when it comes to this sector, we have an amazing amount of talent. For example, from powering a global stock exchange to doing many other things. The year-on-year cumulative annual growth for the IT BPM sector was 13% from 2013 to 2019. So this is much higher than the annual GDP growth of Sri Lanka. This shows that a lot of more emphasis is needed to put into this sector.
Speaking further, he also expanded on the country's way forward in terms of sourcing necessary skills for certain jobs and emphasized the need to increase STEM graduates in Sri Lanka.
When you look at per million, India produces around 5 times more STEM graduates. And this is something that's quite important because, for example, out of the 200,000 people coming out finishing their A-levels, only around 40,000 get into state universities. And even when you look at that, some of them go into art streams and others. So the number going into STEM education is quite low. We only produce even per million 1/5 of what India does. So right now, even sometimes it's a bit difficult, but in the coming future, there's going to be a huge need. So to draw the line, it would be like till we get the amount of people here, we need to have agreements so that we can have workers from abroad working on visa arrangements. That would be very helpful because that is something that a lot of countries do. So when you bring in talent, for example, from abroad, you learn from their management skills. This was a very good example of how the Chinese looked at FDI in the 1980s. They did not really at that time care about the money being brought in. Their primary goal was to bring in investments and also skilled labor that came from the West to manage the organizations, the technical skills, the technology brought in. And what they did was study that. And most of the people who leave that start their own businesses. If you look at, for example, the rivals of Tesla are mostly ex-employees of Tesla. So what we look at is that not to see foreign labor coming to here to work it as a competition, because it is not a competition. The only reason they're coming into the country is because we don't have the skills at the moment to meet that, or we don't have the supply to meet the demand. So once the supply is met, they will go back. And at the same time, we can learn a lot from them.
There was also a response to the question whether Sri Lanka should focus on increasing free trade agreements or local handholding schemes to encourage exports.
In Sri Lankan context, when you look at FTAs, most of the time it's about importing. People talk about another country flooding in their products into our things. But also there is this advantage about utilizing the FTAs for exports. We have FTAs with India, Pakistan and Singapore. But one thing is that, for example, with India, there are so many products on that list where we can import to India without much hassle. So this thing has not been tapped into. And also the thing about FTAs is that if you look at countries such as Switzerland or Singapore, they have very high export to GDP ratio. At the same time, their import to GDP ratio is also higher. So it's just a thing about more trade. And when you open it up for trade, it leads to innovation. For example, not going into FTAs or keeping import tariffs very high will help our local industries be protected, but they can only with their protection go into the domestic market. They can be dominant in the domestic market, but they are unable to export. But if we are going to develop as a country, we need to export because $80 billion is not enough to grow. So we need to look at exporting. And one thing about FTAs and bring in, for example, allowing major global organizations to import is that it will also make our existing organizations to become more innovative and competitive. And not just will they survive better in Sri Lanka, but they can also compete and find markets for their products abroad.